Awesome. Hello, hello, hello. Welcome everybody to the Writer's Bridge. It is so wonderful to have you here today. We are going to get started in just a couple of moments, but we encourage you to go ahead and start participating in the chat. Go ahead and type into the chat, what is your current home country? And is there a particular country you are interested in transferring to? I see people who I've had conversations with before about where you want to go, what you want to do. Oh, wow. Kristen lives in Portugal. So, Kristen, you're practically Ali and I's neighbor. That's fantastic. Rose moved to Canada from Shrewsbury, never regretted it. Wow. And Diana's in Portugal. We got lots of Portugal people here. Tesha's interested in going to New Zealand. Brian, and Brian, by the way, folks, if you're ever interested in Japan, Brian Watson has a really great Substack where he talks all about life in Japan and what that's like and sharing different elements. Check out Brian's Substack. It's excellent. And Kathy is here. Kathy lived in Ecuador and brought her aging mother there as well. Amy's looking to go to Germany. Go ahead, and if you're just joining us, do drop into the chat. Where are you currently, and where do you want to go next? We are so glad to have you here. So, folks, it's that time. Let's go ahead and get started. We are so glad to have you here. We have a lot to cover. We're going to dive right in. I am your host, Allison K Williams. And my co-host, Sharla, is here with us as well. Say hi, Sharla.
Hi. Sorry, I was letting people in. I'm the
Because Sharla's awesome. And Sharla and I also co-host the Craft Talks webinar series, which you may have seen. Today, we are going to talk about getting out. I'm going to hit the mute all button. So my co-speakers, you're going to end up needing to unmute yourself. Today, we're going to talk about getting out. Are you worried about cultural and political trends in your home country? Are you seeking a different way of life? Today, for the expat curious, we are going to talk about the facts and the feelings about living abroad. Our special guests and myself have all lived or are living overseas. And between the five of us, we have navigated long-term visas as Americans and Canadians. We've been unemployed, self-employed, retired, students, employed. We have bought, rented, and renovated homes. Don't even ask me about the state of my roof right now. We have brought an aging parent abroad and figured out whether or not to live in the same place. We have schooled children and prepared them for university, either in our home country or in another country entirely. We've learned a new language. Some of us didn't have to learn a new language. We have learned new social and class systems, dealt with multi-country taxes, and at least one of us has moved back to the USA and experienced re-entry and all the joy that brings. In a moment, I'll ask our guests to introduce themselves, but first, two important things.
First, quite a few members of our community who have themselves lived abroad. We invite you to also to introduce yourself in the chat and your experience. We always have a lively chat here at the Writer's Bridge, and we encourage you to offer your expertise, ask each other questions, and respond to questions you have answers for. To respond to a specific person, you can click their comment and reply below, or put that person's name in all caps in your comment so they know that you are talking to them specifically. We'll share a link in the chat when we share the episode on YouTube so you can get all the great information, and also make sure you subscribe to the Writer's Bridge on YouTube so you see the replay right away, and I'll pop that URL into the chat. And just a reminder, I'll probably be marking questions that I'm hoping that I can share with the guest today. I'll probably mark them with a red question mark symbol, so if you see that, please just ignore it. Please don't use it. That will help me stay organized.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you, Sharla. And we also, before we start, we want to call out privilege. So we will get into some details as we go through today, but it takes a fair amount of self-confidence to move abroad, and some of that self-confidence is fed by money. Migrating feels and is different based on your race, your class, your ethnicity, and your home country. And all of our panelists today are fortunate fortunate enough to have what we call a good passport, in that it has a lot more options for us. And all of us are also lucky that we got to make a choice. With that in mind, emigrating by choice is a lot like celebrity memoir. It is a different category of paperwork, and it's a different place on the shelf. We are not taking spots that would otherwise go to asylum seekers or people who are desperately in need. We are participating in programs that are specifically tailored to people who are migrating by choice. And so we just want to set up that that's what we're covering today. We don't want to overlook people who must migrate because they're facing a terrible situation at home. That is not the experience that we have had, and that's not what we're going to be talking about today. But we do recognize that that is the situation, unfortunately, for many people. Sharla.
I'd like to ask our guests to introduce themselves, tell us what you write, where you're from, where you live, any family that live with you, your visa status, and your job career situation in your country. So who would like to start?
Alia, will you unmute yourself and dive in?
Sure. Hello, everybody. I know some of you already. Nice to see your faces. I am a memoirist. I do memoir with a heavy research component. I'm currently under contract with a Simon & Schuster imprint for my second book, so I'm working on that. I live in central Portugal on a tiny little, absolutely gorgeous beach that no one has ever heard of. I moved here with my husband in 2023. And my mom followed. She's an artist, working artist, and she came over maybe about 6 months later, 9 months later. It was 9 months later. She lives in the town next door, and is happy as can be. My husband and I have our residency cards at this point. Took a while. Paperwork is not cute. Segueing to not cute paperwork, my mom is still in limbo. We're trying to get her family reunification status, and the immigration system in Portugal is so backed up that she hasn't been able to get an appointment in almost a year. But she's not going to get kicked out. She's just kind of waiting for the option to come up to submit her application. So that's our situation. Very happy to be here.
Awesome. Thank you. Deb, what about you? Unmute yourself.
There it is. Hi, everybody. My name's Deborah. I moved to Abu Dhabi, which is down the road from Dubai, which is where Allison is. Sort of think New York City, Philadelphia. That's kind of the relationship. I moved to Abu Dhabi with my 2 kids and my husband, and about 12 suitcases and a whole bunch of carry-ons. It was a nightmare for what we thought was going to be a year of adventure. My husband and I were both teaching at NYU Abu Dhabi, which had just opened. It was a year into operation when we got there. It was going to be our year of adventure. We're literature professors. We live in New York, which means we're basically broke. So not a lot of opportunities for travel and seeing the world. So we moved for a year, thought it was going to be our year of big adventure, and we stayed for 11. Raised our kids, traveled in parts of the world I would never be able to access from here. Love the desert, love Abu Dhabi, met Allison, and we moved back in July of 2022, back to New York. And I was lucky enough to move back to a job and an apartment and all of those things. But I really, really, really miss my expat life. And I miss the warmth, I miss the beach, and I miss the desert. The desert out there is extraordinary and magical. So I'll stay there.
Brilliant. Tara Phillips. I asked, and then I pronounced it wrong anyway.
It's okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Tara. I am currently living in Paris, France, but I'm from Brooklyn, New York. And I moved to Paris with my cat, but I actually was supposed to move with my 14-year-old son at the time. But his father, he and I were not together, but his father had proposed that he take our son for a year while I moved to Paris. And so I ended up moving to Paris on my own. which was a huge adjustment, but it ended up becoming something we called a mombatical. Instead of sabbatical, it was a mombatical. And that actually became the platform for my blog. So I've been blogging since, I guess, 2018, off and on. I actually did write a book about my experiences being away from my son for a year, to reclaim my spiritual and emotional self without the daily demands of parenting. And so that's something that I'm sort of focusing on as a writer. And I have a liberal professionnel visa in Paris. So I'm basically an independent contractor. I do work in the US. And I actually, in the last 2 years, was running an organization called La Maison Baldwin, which is a French association that honors the life and legacy of James Baldwin by supporting writers of color with residencies and conferences. So that's the other gig I have. I have other gigs around, but the visa that I have is essentially a residency, and I am up for renewal. And thanks to French administration, the first appointment I could get is like 3 months after my visa expires, but that's okay. I have my appointment and everything. So that's my current situation. And yeah, I'm really happy to be here and talk about what it was like to make this transition, especially when I thought I would have my son and then I didn't end up having my son with me. It was a lot emotionally as well.
Yeah, I can imagine. I can
Yeah.
imagine. Joj, how about you? Unmute and tell us.
Well, I'm Joj, and my pronouns are they, them. I write nonfiction, a narrative nonfiction, flash essay, and memoir, and I dabble in poetry. I actually grew up nomadic in the United States on food stamps and government cheese, and went to France to study. That was the guise that I used. I'm like, I really need to get to France to perfect my French as a student, as a university student. But I secretly hoped that I would meet somebody and be able to stay. And that actually ended up happening. So I met a person, and we got married, and we moved back and forth. And we have 4 kids, 3 born in the States, 1 born in France. We currently live in southern France. 2 of them are at universities and 2 are still at home. 1 in high school, 1 in middle school. I have dual citizenship, which means that I even have a birth certificate. I have a French birth certificate, a passport, an identity card, and everything. I went as a student again, so I had to go through the whole carte de séjour thing. But now I'm a French person. While my current main gig is taking care of my kids and my cat, as a writing parent, I also teach ESL from time to time because I have an MA TESOL. So that does help, as the French say, put a little butter in the spinach from time to time. So that's my sitch. Really
Love
happy to
it.
be here.
So glad to have you. And I'm Allison K Williams. I'm one of your regular co-hosts of The Writer's Bridge. I'm the author of 7 drafts and a whole bunch of plays. I'm a Canadian who grew up in Florida and Canada. And before I left the USA, I lived in Kalamazoo, Michigan for about 12 years. After I did NGO work and some personal travels in India and lived for a short while in South Africa, I moved to Dubai, where my husband and I have been for 12 years. And our tables have somewhat turned in that I started as a spouse visa. Like, my identity card actually said housewife on it, which just hurt my soul. But I eventually got a cultural golden visa as a writer. Now that my husband has retired, he is now a non-working spouse on my visa, which is kind of fun. I'm a freelance editor. I lead retreats and classes virtually and around the world. And my husband and I are getting ready to leave Dubai. We have purchased purchased a house in Portugal to host writing retreats and writers at work. And we are now in the application process for D7 visas, which are passive income and retirement visas. Because one of the awesome things about being a writer is royalties count as passive income. And so if you are able to write something that generates an ongoing trickle of money, that helps contribute to the amount of money that many countries will make you show before they let you live there. So, Sharla, what are we going to start with question-wise?
Yeah, I mean, I've thought it was so funny when Allison emailed me about this special writer's bridge, because I have been having these conversations as well in my little orb. And I feel like it has a lot to do with everyone has a little bit of fatigue right now with US culture, specifically our politics. I don't have to like go more into that. I think we all know what I'm saying. But you know, we're thinking about what are the options. So I guess my question is, when let's say, George, when you first immigrated, were you moving towards something or were you moving away?
The answer to that question is yes. I was moving towards something, but also moving away from something. Like I said, I grew up nomadic and poor. And when I say nomadic, it's not like, luxury camping car situation. It's more like a camper mounted on the back of a pickup. My mom was a seasonal worker, so we moved from state to state constantly without basic comforts and stuff. And there was a stigma kind of attached to that of being sort of trailer trash. And so I was running away from that, the squalor and the abuse and all the poverty. But I was also running to France specifically because I had seen all of these movies that made it seem like France was so transformative. All it takes is to have a French friend, and they will turn you from the loser into the winner. Or like Sabrina, you go over there as, the chauffeur's daughter and come back as Sabrina that everybody wants to dance with and romance at the Long Island garden party. And I wanted that. So yes, both.
Thank you. Tara, do you mind sharing?
Sure. So I think my answer is probably both too. I mean, as a African American, the social and political situation in the United States is always pretty tentative. And so I remember, though, specifically in 2012, when the Sandy Hook shooting happened, and our Republican legislators did nothing in response to it. I knew at that moment that I would need to have to leave the United States. I didn't know when it was going to happen, but I just knew in that moment that my values did not align in any way with the dominant values in the United States in terms of our institutions. And so I was running a charter school in Brooklyn. And then in 2015, I was there from 2013 to 2018, but in 2015, I had the opportunity to do an executive master's program that was a partnership between the University of Oxford and HEC Paris, which is it's a business school here in Paris. And I didn't have to move here. It was every other month modules that lasted for about a week. And so every other month for about a year, a little over a year, I was traveling back and forth from Brooklyn to Paris or Brooklyn to Oxford. And I just felt like after I felt like once I was ready to transition from the charter school, that Paris was where I wanted to live. The other piece of that is that my son, he at the time he had always known he wanted to be a chef. So I thought, oh, perfect. We can go to Paris and he can learn how to be a chef and it'll just be great. And so, so that was also part of the motivation, was to get him out of the US as a growing teenage young Black kid. And also for me to just kind of have a different life and step away from the US. But also I had always loved France, and I had spent more time here because of that master's program. So it's crazy now I think about, because my son is about a month away from graduating from the Culinary Institute, which is in the United States. But so he didn't come to Paris and learn how to be a chef, but still, it was just fun to fantasize and entertain that as well for him. Yeah, so
I bet he did get to eat well though when he
yeah,
visited.
yeah. I mean, anytime he visits me too, he's kind of, he's not impressed because he's been here so often, but it is always fun to kind of do the culinary thing with him here.
It's awesome. Thank you so much. Alia.
Yeah, also a yes. I wonder if that's going to be all of our answers. I grew up in a very alternative household, and very much in the underground. My folks were involved in a cannabis bakery that was quite big for its time, and as a kid, where I was keeping secrets, and it was just, we were always apart from US culture, and I always felt very displaced there. I felt displaced as a child, and I felt displaced as I got older as well. So when I began traveling as an adult in my early 20s, I felt, I don't know, I just felt so much more relaxed. I suppose navigating cultures where I didn't expect myself to fit in. So from those very early exposures, I had this idea in my head, you know what? The American dream, it's not for me anyway, and it's not the only dream, and this is not the only way of life. There are other ways of life, and I've traveled pretty ferociously throughout my life, really just looking for different ways to connect. So this was it was a long-term plan. When I met my husband 15 years ago, I probably told him after a week, I am not staying here. So if you want to hitch your cart to this, you want to hitch your pony to this trailer or whatever, I don't know, I can't even think of the expression. We're going somewhere else. We're not staying in the US long term. Now, the destination has changed, but I also really believe in moving toward a place. You have to, I don't know. The destination changed a few times. Portugal came onto into our purview in about 2019, and from there, I'll talk about this later, but a lot of things aligned to make this a workable place to go, a combination of practicalities and pleasures and liking it and vibing with it. But yeah, I think there was just this need to get out of the US. My God. If I was still there right now, I would be packing my bags.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't run away from MAGA, but I would if I hadn't already. That's me.
Thank you so much for sharing. And Deborah, is it the same for you?
It was a little bit both. I was living in New York. My husband and I were both literature professors. I was commuting an hour out of the city to my job. I had 2 little kids. I remember I applied for an exemption to jury duty. And I was like, well, I'm a full-time caregiver and I have a full-time job. And the woman at the courthouse said, honey, that's not good math. I'm like, you're right. It sucks. So when NYU sort of first launched itself in Abu Dhabi, my husband was involved in the planning committee, and you can imagine that it was sort of like kids in a candy store, like, let's plan a new university that's never existed before. What should the kids do? What should we teach? It was like a magic. And he spent a year commuting back and forth from Abu Dhabi to New York while I was working full time with 2 little kids. There was a night, I remember he called me after having been at a planning session that involved many bottles of red wine. And it's about a 9-hour time difference. So he was like, oh my God, it was this amazing conversation, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, so I spent the afternoon picking lice out of our kids' hair. So actually, you really need to stop talking now, like right this second, or I'm leaving you. So I was leaving lice and New York City, and thinking this was just going to be an adventure, and it was going to be starting at this new university with students from all over the world, and that was going to be really exciting. And New York, people think of New York as very international, but it's also incredibly parochial. Our 2 kids were both in a gifted and talented school, which is a public school that has a more accelerated curriculum or whatever. and it's really hard to get into. It's like a lottery, it's whatever. And when I said we were moving, people were like, but you have 2 seats at Nest. How can you leave? Oh my God. And it's like, we're just like, it's just school, but they couldn't understand why we might want to unhook from from having the United States as our center of gravity. Because New York is the only place ever. So we moved, and so we were moving towards this exciting new thing, and we were very lucky because NYU, it's in its early days, I don't think it's quite so cushy anymore. It arranged all the things, the visas and the this and the that. All we had to do was supply approximately 25,000 passport photos of everybody in our family for all of the different documents and different and so when we got there, it was we landed in the middle of August, in the middle of Ramadan. It was about 120 degrees. Everything was closed during the day because it's Ramadan. I had 2 little kids. There was nowhere to go. It was too hot to go to the beach because the sand burned and the water was hot. And I cried more. I cried in the grocery store pretty much every time I went to the grocery store. And also it was really exciting. My husband, his mother is from the Philippines and his dad's from Karachi. And his dad is a Zoroastrian. You can Google it. But Zoroastrian, saying you're a Parsi in Abu Dhabi is the only time people didn't say, oh, Farsi? And no, Parsi. And in Abu Dhabi, people understood that, but here people don't. So it was just 1,000 different adjustments that I grew really to love. I loved being off balance, right? Like it's not my center of gravity. It's not my place. People like me are not in the ads, and it just was really exciting.
Yeah. Like Deb, I ended up in the United Arab Emirates. I kind of moved here by accident. I would never have picked Dubai. I never would have picked the Middle East. But as I was getting ready to retire from my circus career, and as I was getting ready to date again after the end of an unfortunate and extremely expensive relationship, I set my dating profile to Dubai because I knew I was going there to work. I used to be a professional circus performer. I was performing at a theme park in Dubai. And thanks to OK Cupid, I met a British man who already lived here, and I stayed for him. And it has really grown on me. It's been surprisingly great to be a writer here. It's clean, it's very safe. And because it is an authoritarian monarchy, I am legally forbidden from caring about politics, which frees up a lot of mental space for writing, which I have to say. Plus, because the upper class here is into the arts, when people want art to happen, they throw money until it happens. And that's something I would suggest too when you're thinking about a country. Look at what do you value? Like not just what are you moving away from, but what do you want to move towards? What kind of life do you want to enjoy? And pick a country that embodies that. Recently, Deb found a great article in the New York Times, and we're going to drop a gift link in the chat so that you can read it, by Lydia Polgreen about how Africans and Asians are picking the United Arab Emirates to migrate to over North America because here, frankly, the living conditions are generally better for those who are migrating by choice. And it's a class-based society rather than a race-based society. You're still going to experience severe differences in treatment based on who you are, but it's much more about country of origin. It's much more about your education. It's much more about what accent do you have when you open your mouth rather than straight up skin color. My husband is a Black man. He's British. His parents are Jamaican. In Dubai, he is functionally a European rather than a Black man, because when he opens his mouth, he's got a British accent. So if you're looking for different races, different places where your ethnicity will be honored. And I'll just quickly touch, Ricky in the chat says, I've heard the UAE is extremely expensive. It depends entirely on the kind of life you want to live. I live 20 minutes from the nearest mall on the edge of town. My rent is a lot cheaper than it was in the US. If I want to eat yogurt and I buy the local yogurt, it's $1 for a container. If I want to buy the Dannon yogurt shipped in from America, it's $5 a container. So a lot of it is also about embracing your new culture. Tara, could you tell us a little bit about how is it as a woman of color in Europe? Are you getting the same racism? Are you getting different racism? You know, how's that going?
Well, there's a huge history of African Americans moving to Paris in particular, particularly post-war. The soldiers felt more comfortable here, and then a lot of artists and musicians and writers as well. So there's definitely a privilege. I'm seen more as an American than I am as a Black woman here. And it's funny because as a New Yorker, I get like this extra bit of street cred. Like Parisians love New York and New Yorkers. And so it turns like it starts off with, oh, are you from the United States? I'm like, yeah. And then it's like, where are you from? New York. Then it's like, oh, and it becomes a whole conversation. And so I don't ever feel too often that like race is as much of an issue for me. However, I'm part of a large expat community of color, and we have members from the entire African diaspora. And so I do know that the experiences that North Africans and West Africans in particular in France and in Paris is very different. And so many of my African American friends, those of us that are here, we're very mindful that we have a privilege here in terms of our treatment because we're US citizens, because we're Americans, because we have the American pedigree, as opposed to those of West or North African heritage who may even be are French in the sense that they were born here or grew up here, but they oftentimes experience, I think, a lot of the similar racism that we do in the United States. So it's interesting. I mean, what's nice is like every day I'm not walking around feeling my Blackness, which is in the United States, I feel it all the time. And it can be as simple as I lived in San Francisco at one point. I remember I was in Pacific Heights where my job was and actually where my home was. And I remember just standing at the light waiting across the street. And this woman looked at me and she said, well, what are you doing here? And it was just a weird, like I'm just walking from my job to get some lunch, but there was definitely that microaggression of like, what are you doing here? And I've had that experience in multiple places in the US. One thing that I did do when I was running the charter school was I had the opportunity to bring students here. So the charter school was based in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, low income, majority kids of color. And we brought 15 students here in 2016 and then 2017 and 2018. And it was extraordinary to see how they were treated, and it was mostly, I think, because children are valued here, seen as like precious here. And so the kids they just couldn't get over how they were being treated in this city. Whereas if you had 15, middle schoolers walking around, say Brooklyn Heights or Park Slope or any suburban city or area in the US, there would be, I think calls would be made, so that was something special too, to give them that experience and help them see like the world is theirs, and we don't have to be, our orbit doesn't have to be defined by our experiences in the United States.
Joj, before we dive into our next question, could you touch briefly? You use they, them pronouns. You are a more gender fluid person. Has your treatment as a person, the way you visibly present, been different for you in the US versus in France? Unmute yourself.
Yes, the treatment. It's hard to say whether or not it's better or worse. I feel like up until fairly recently, I felt really supported in American circles. It's where I actually learned the lingo. It's where I learned to talk about these things, where I finally realized that I had permission to even explore gender and, that it even existed, this thing that I had always felt. In France, the reception is curiosity. It's because it is kind of novel. I mean, of course it's not novel. Of course we're there. You know, we've always existed. The LGBTQ community is, I would say, just as celebrated in certain circles. I have not felt the same brand of animosity towards difference in queerness in France or in Europe in general. I have felt very celebrated. There are linguistic considerations because French is a Latinate language, and they do have masculine and feminine. Like all of the nouns are masculine and feminine, and all of the adjectives have to be adjusted for that, and even personal pronouns, whereas you would say he or she. Well, we're just now incorporating a non-binary pronoun system, and it in itself is sort of fluid. There are like 5 to 7 different pronouns that you can use, and so the community hasn't really come together. The trans community hasn't come together yet. It's still sort of in its nascent phase, but yeah, so I would say that up until recently, I felt safe and celebrated in the States, but now I'm actually being very careful. I just got back to the States last night, and going through the airport, I've just been careful to be extra feminine. And I don't know if this is just because of, you know, all the news that I get when I'm in Europe is the sensationalized stuff, or if, you know, I really do need to play up, you know, stick my boobs out to protect myself. So I guess it remains to be seen. I'm going to be here for 5 weeks, so I'll report back on that.
Thank you for sharing both of your experiences. Very enlightening. I have questions about visas. Visas a broad range from, hey, please come be a nomad, fill out this form, and all the way to years of paperwork, language lessons, and proof of income and physical health. What kind of preparation did you do to be allowed to live where you live? Let's start with Deborah.
As I said, we were really lucky because NYU handled all the visa stuff. So we just had to supply and there were tons of, birth certificates and photos and health attestations. We had the added layer of, there was the stuff we needed for our visas, but then also the stuff we needed for our kids' schools, which would seem to replicate. And you'd think, well, it's here, but no, you need a separate over here. So, and then when we got to Abu Dhabi, we needed to have medical exams and eye exams, medical and eye
blood
exams.
tests. They
blood
X-ray your
tests,
lungs
right,
because they
right.
don't let anybody in who's got TB scars.
Right. So it was, it's starting to be a long time ago. So we didn't have the experience of having to go make a visa appointment for ourselves and wade through the bureaucracy. We had a guide that sort of took us through it. And then that needed to be renewed. But again, NYU took care of that. We had friends who had, we did have to, although it's changed, we did have to specify for the UAE visa. Allison, I don't know if you had to do this. We did have to specify our religion. And
Yes.
so I think that's gone now. But most people at NYU, we were all Buddhists. We were just Buddhists. We just put Buddhist. And that was easy. The only friends who had partners, but they weren't married, those people came in on guest visas. Or sort of tourist visas. And that meant that I can't remember now, 3 months, something like that, you had to go to a different place and then come back, like re-enter the country.
I'm going to chime in on that, Deb.
Thanks.
So When I first moved to Dubai, I wasn't married, and it's not anymore for non-Muslims. Non-married people can cohabitate, but at the time, non-married people could not cohabitate. It was more like they weren't hunting you down, but you didn't want to piss off the neighbors. I wore a fake wedding ring for a while, and I wouldn't have stayed if I wasn't very serious about my relationship. But in Dubai, you can only get a visa through an employer, and they do now have a self-employment option. But there's an employer involved every single time. I was making visa runs to Oman, so I traveled a lot. But anytime I was in the country more than 30 days continuously, I had to drive to Oman, get stamped out of Dubai, get stamped back into Dubai, cross the border back in again to reset. There was a day actually that I just like flew to Qatar for the afternoon because it was like a 30-minute flight. I find too that somebody in the chat asked about where can you go to figure out where you like, where you want to be. And somebody else in the chat pointed out Americans are good for a year's visa with no paperwork or very little paperwork in Albania. And Albania is beautiful, it is inexpensive, and it's a great place to check out other places in Europe. And if you're interested in Europe, countries that are part of the Schengen agreement limit your stay to 90 days out of 180. So some people take their 90 days, then they go to an Eastern European country to wait out the clock until they can come back in. Alia, once I get my Portuguese visa, which I'm currently in the process of, I am only technically allowed to leave and come back once before getting a resident card. And the government right now is about 10 months behind on resident cards, and I travel for a living. Alia, how did you deal with the restrictions on your movement while you had gotten your visa, you're in the country, but you don't yet have your official residence card?
I was just happy to be here. I'm just gonna say I was just really happy to be here. I stayed. I mean, I just stayed put. It is unfortunately I'm not in your situation. I'm a working author. I am under contract with a book. My job is to sit in front of this desk and write. Not always my favorite job, but it is my job. I also, I just did my freelance editing work that I do over Zoom. So I stayed put. My mom is, she's a working artist, and now she is in the situation, as I mentioned, where we haven't been able to get a family reunification appointment. So she's sitting here on an expired visa. She doesn't feel in danger. They're not going to kick her out. Portugal is not in the business of kicking moms out. That's not how this works here. But she can't go anywhere, and so it is something that people run into. It took us 9 months to get our residency cards, and as soon as we got them, we went on a trip. You just have to factor that in. Unfortunately, people have relatives at home. If there's an illness or something like that, it can cause a lot of complication. I think you can get a special dispensation if you have a medical emergency, or if somebody in your immediate family does, but I don't think it is easy to get. So this is a challenge. Yeah, I mean, the bureaucracy, will say about Portugal, one of the reasons we chose Portugal is that it has a fairly it's a fairly welcoming immigration system. You can immigrate here on a middle-class income. It is entirely possible to do. You can even find some workarounds to some of the visas, as we did. We came in on a retirement visa, even though we're not retired. There's a certain way that you can make it happen. And in that sense, it was one of the more practical choices, but the paperwork is out of control, very archaic bureaucracy, and you just have to deal with the stacks of paper. You just have to deal with the rubber stamps. I have a friend who said, and it never left my head, that the most powerful person in Europe is a man with a rubber stamp.
We have so many questions in the chat. Are we ready to dive in? All right. So Luz asks, I have no idea where to start. How does one go from Canada to Portugal or Spain for a few months to begin with? What kind of visa would I need if I intend to spend time writing there? Does anyone have any?
Tourist visa, it's 3 months, 90 days. Come on over, check it out, see what you like. That works for Portugal is Spain or Spain. I think I posted, I tried to upload. There's if you're interested in Portugal, there is a Facebook group that we'll post in the chat. And I know that Allison knows about it as well. That's the American and Friends PT group. And they have really all of the information that you could possibly need in the files for immigrating to Portugal. They're very thorough documents elaborating the visa requirements and the steps. Go through those. But you can come and check it out. You don't need a special visa.
Great. So this is a question for all of you. Did any of you move based on your own business or freelance work? And if you did move for your freelance work, what were the requirements? This is asked by Ricky.
And I know Justin also asked a question about how do you establish like an editing clientele. Somebody asked, how do you establish coaching clients? So I started my freelance business kind of by necessity because I retired from circus and I was supposed to be here in Dubai doing a stage management job that fell through at the last minute. And I was fortunate that my partner paid my rent. I lived with him. And so I was not, trying to frantically figure out where to live while I was building my editing business. But I had built it like any other freelance business. And so I would say it is not so much how do I build a business specifically to migrate, it's how do I build the business I want to have and make sure enough of it is virtual that I can live where I want to live. I know Tesha asked earlier in the chat about how can I get an international coaching client who will bring me over. It is deeply unlikely that a foreign country anywhere will bring you over because they are usually required by law to offer the job to their nationals first. Tara, you went from working for a school to working for a foundation. How did you make getting a job in a brand new country happen?
Well, those things didn't happen consecutively. When I first moved here, I did the 90-day thing. I was like, let me see if I can, I was trying to see if I could do it. And so that's when I started writing, and I just was living off of savings and then coming in and out of the country. But then the pandemic hit. And so suddenly I was stuck here, but France had the thing where if you were here and you weren't supposed to still be here, you could just send an email to, I don't know, it's some administrative office in, who knows where. And that was kind of the record of saying like, okay, you can stay put because it wasn't safe really to travel. But then when I started doing the consulting work, I basically established myself as a consultant in the US. And then when I applied for my visa, I provided all the different contracts that I had. And one of them, working for La Maison Baldwin, I wasn't an employee, I was hired as an independent contractor. And so the visa that I have, if you have multiple contracts, then from France's perspective, they just want to make sure that you have income and that you're not living on the street. And so that was beneficial for me to have both US and French clients, so to speak. And then also because I had the degree from HEC, that was a huge feather in my cap. I mean, when you with certain visas, you have to go through an integration process in France. And so I had to go to this I had to go have a language test, and then I had to sit down and have a conversation with somebody to ask about like what were the things that I needed in order to integrate. And when I had mentioned that I had this business degree from what is one of the top business schools in Europe, they just were like, oh, here, so I got like all of the exemptions of civics courses and things like that. So I was in a pretty unique situation with respect to that. But there's so many different types of visas relative to work. I know people who have talent visas and they have to show their artistic work. Of course, there are tourist visas, there are retirement visas. So that does require some research. But yeah, generally, I mean, the US and France have a pretty solid relationship. And from what I can tell when I talk with other friends is that there's always a way for an American. It may require a lot of annoying phone calls and meetings and stuff, but generally people get it done.
If I can just jump in here for a minute, which is to say, and I noticed this when we moved to Abu Dhabi, that it's very, the sort of standard imagination of expat life is France, Portugal, Spain, maybe the Netherlands, although to stay in the Netherlands, you have to learn Dutch, which is harder than Portuguese, maybe.
They do also have the Dutch-American Friendship Treaty, where Americans, it's basically a thank you for saving us from the Nazis.
Right.
And Americans who want to start a brand new business can move over to the Netherlands and start a brand new business. And that's a relatively even thing. Back to you, Deb.
No, I would just suggest to anyone who's thinking about pulling up stakes is it's a really big world. Right? Vietnam is beautiful and cheap. All, South America, Costa Rica, Belize, and also there are beautiful, amazing cities all over the world. I get one of the consequences of having lived abroad for as long as I did is, there's that New York parochialism again of like, oh my God, it's the only city in the world. And I think like, you sound like such an idiot. Have you not been to Bangkok? Have you not been to Paris? Have you not been to London? Blah, blah. So if you're thinking about moving out, just, give yourself permission to kind of really look around for a while. And things, somebody in the chat said something about Brazil, for instance. That would be amazing. So it's just, yeah, I mean, they're sort of easy choices, but then there are lots and lots of other places.
Probably because of familiarity and culture, right?
Of course. But, places like Abu Dhabi, like I don't have to speak Arabic. You can just go there. In fact, if you move to Abu Dhabi and learn and actually spoke Urdu, you'd be much better off.
Or Tagalog. Tagalog would be a way better language to have here. Yeah,
exactly. So anyway, I just wanted to.
That's great. Yeah, let's remind everyone that's a really big world. Lots of different choices here. Lots of things to explore. So Dakota asked questions specifically for Deb and Joj. How do you help your kids adjust to new schools and new cultures? Was that a challenge for you? Was that an opportunity? Maybe both.
I just wanted to say real quick, because I wanted to sort of piggyback on what Deb was saying, but to say also that if you are here and you're listening to us and we're talking about travel around and see this place and see that place and the world is big and you're thinking, how the hell am I going to pay for that? That was my situation. And this may not, I went as a student and I was in my 20s, but I went as a student. And if you are a member of a university and you can get financial aid and you can do a study abroad program, some sort of exchange thing, that is another way to go and have it somewhat subsidized, have it be cheaper, even if you're an older adult. It's a way for you to get somewhere and look around. And if you are somewhere, especially, my situation is Europe. Once you're in Europe, once you have all of the paperwork that you need, you can travel around to the other European countries and check those out on weekends, etc. Because travel here is actually pretty efficient here. Travel in France and Europe is pretty efficient and relatively inexpensive. So I just wanted to throw that in there. As far as the kids thing is concerned, my particular situation is a little different because my partner is French. So, I will say that the moving back and forth was difficult because we had our children in the US. My partner has American citizenship because we were married. So I got his and he got mine, and we went to school together, and he actually got a degree from Penn State. So, but preparing the kids to move back and forth was difficult. Being born in the US and having a preschool situation here, and then moving to France and the preschool situation there being completely different. The parenting culture completely different. The divide between adults and children different. School has been probably the most difficult thing for our family is navigating school. We are currently in an international school situation, so our kids go to a multilingual school, but that is, again, that has to do with our individual situation. It's where we are and that's available to us. Before that happened, trying to get my kids integrated into the French system, the educators' approaches to children and to educating is completely different from the ludic sort of fun and nurturing and colorful experience that you'll get in the States. In France, it's very clinical. The walls don't have bulletin boards with seasonal that change with the season and holidays and stuff. They are required to learn and recite poetry, which is wonderful. They are required to learn when they learn to write, they learn to write in cursive. They don't learn to print until high school. So there are all of these different things. And that was probably, I think in general, just those differences in culture were the things that made things most difficult. And difficult, surmountable, obviously. We've done it and my kids are thriving and they're very happy to be in France and to stay there. They got the opportunity to go back to the US to study at the university level and they didn't want to. I wonder why.
My kids, my kids are older now. They're out, one is out of university. Weirdly, they started at the American International School in Abu Dhabi. That was just what NYU sort of said to us. And they were amazed because, you know, they were at public schools in New York. And then here we were at a school that had like patios outside and an outside swimming pool. And it looked like, you know, fantasy land. And then it didn't turn out to be academically a great school. And that can be something that people find at international schools, which is a kind of reluctance to move out on either ends of the spectrum. They kind of teach to the middle. And so we moved them weirdly. So my kids are American mixed race kids from New York living in Abu Dhabi, going to British style schools, complete with like uniforms and little jackets and shorts. My younger son started in the uniform with shorts and he looked like the, what's that lead singer from AC/DC? That's what he looked like in the morning going off to school, like do. And they changed schools a couple of times, even within that. And that was no harder than if your kid starts a new school in whatever city you live in. It's just, you know, slightly different habits, different kids. Angus Young, exactly. Thank you. So at the time when they were there in their British style education, what I appreciated is that the sciences were broken out. So for 4 years, they got biology and chemistry and physics. And in the US, you do a year of physics and then you do a year of chemistry and then you don't do it all at once. And I liked that they were required to take Arabic for the whole time they were there, which was great, but the teaching wasn't very good. So they didn't learn Arabic. And also to sidestep a lot of the, you know, right before we moved, there was a guy in our building, one of the facilities guys, who said, oh, you know, you're so lucky that you're moving to Abu Dhabi. It's so safe there. And of course, in the US, people say you're moving to the Middle East. Oh my God, my parents were like, are you do they have an evacuation plan? Like, oh my God.
Do you have to cover? Are you going to be allowed to
cover?
drive?
Are you going to,
like
no, they wouldn't.
Saudi Arabia.
They just say, do you have to, you know, like wear a football helmet or a beekeeping suit or a whatever. So there are all these questions and it wasn't regarded as safe. And when this guy said it's so safe, such a safe place to raise kids, I was like, what? I don't nobody had said that. And then I got there and I realized that it's a lot harder. You have to know really, really rich people to get drugs if you're in high school. My kids didn't. There are no guns. So my kids went off to college. My son is now at school in the US after doing a year in Amsterdam. My older son went to Oxford because he went to a British school and that was just the pipeline. And anybody with college age kids, we had to pay full freight for him to go to Oxford because he's an international student. And it was still cheaper than a private university in the United States. He got into Columbia which gave him like $30,000 a year. And it was still cheaper to pay for him to go to Oxford. Like, just put that in your head as you're thinking about your children.
And it seems like a lot of this is a mindset shift. I want to ask each one of you, because more than anything, living abroad is a new mindset. And I also want to let you guys know we're going to run about 10 minutes over today. I'm also dropping a link into the chat. We have Kathy McCullough with us today, who has great experience living all over the world. And Kathy put together a terrific list of questions to ask yourself, things to consider when choosing a new country. I'll drop the link for you guys to sign up for it. I can't, the chat will not let me drop the PDF into it, so I'll be emailing it out right after this meeting. If you're watching this on the YouTube replay, that sign up link is down there in the description of the video. So folks, more than anything, living abroad is a new mindset. What has shifted for you between your original country and your new country? How has living abroad changed you? Tara, how has living abroad changed you?
Well, it's interesting when you mentioned mindset, because the premise for my moving, or like this other sort of context, was this mombatical, right? Like, I thought I was carrying over just parenting, but in a different country. And once that wasn't the case for me, the time that I was spending here was more about like reclaiming my own spiritual and emotional self. And so a lot of the experiences that I was having were focused on like, how were they just enriching me as a person, but also like reacquainting me with myself after having been so focused on raising a kid for 14 years. And so I've been trying to just project that sense of sort of wonder and whimsy and joy that I experienced by being here on my own. One thing that I started doing a few years back is, I used to do theater when I was in high school, and then I walked away from it. It was a huge passion, and then I suddenly had the time to get engaged with an amateur theater group here in Paris, and I've been doing shows every year, and it's amazing to me that that's something that's back in my life. And so I think the mindset shift is really about just like not having any limitations. It's not easy. Like, it was really lonely at times, and it didn't help being here during the pandemic, but it was just this, like, creating space to focus on myself and allowing Paris to inspire me in a way that the United States was really like the mindset shift that I had made. And not that I couldn't have done acting in New York, who knows, but moving abroad gave me the opportunity to kind of create space in my mind and in my heart and in my soul in a way that I don't think I would have had done if I was still back in the US.
Alia, what's your mind shift been?
I was thinking about this. I was thinking about how there was a moment about 2 weeks after we got here, and everything was still very new and overwhelming. We're driving around one of these hectic roundabouts. And even like as whoa, I felt my shoulders detach from my ears. And I thought, I don't have to go back ever again. We get to stay here and live this simple life. Portugal is the lifestyle is very simple. It's very quiet. It's very peaceful. And I'm not a peaceful or simple or quiet person. So there was a real period of adjustment, getting used to just being with myself and kind of tuning into the rhythms of the ocean and just meeting my neighbors and not worrying about whether they're, part of the literary community or whatever crap was so in my head. Is like, everything has to be a career move and everything has to be a lot of that falls away. It's just, it's a peaceful place, and peace is also a complicated state of mind. It's not always comfortable. So I think that has been a real huge change for me.
Joj, how has your mindset shifted living in France?
Well, when I first came to France, remember that I had stars in my eyes and I thought it was going to be one thing that it was going to be like a microwave that I was just going to step into, and a year later, ding, I'd be done and would be sophisticated and all that stuff. And I thought that having had a rough childhood would prepare me for the culture shock. And that wasn't the case. It was really, really difficult when I first got to France. And I mean, to the point of contemplating suicide, because it was my answer. It was like I had put all these eggs in this basket, and France had just like stomped all over my eggs. So there was a learning curve. It took me probably a decade to actually like France. And for me, where things shifted is when I finally stopped trying to fit in. When I finally just copped to the fact that I don't have the decades of commercials and other cultural capital, and that I will always be a noob, and that I will always be the American, no matter how fluent, no matter how bilingual, no matter, I had to relearn how to be smart, because I was smart. That was my currency back home, was I was smart. I had good grades. I was on the honor roll. I was on the dean's list. I got to France and I wasn't smart anymore. I couldn't be smart in French. I couldn't be funny. All the things that I had used to sort of as my hustle to like get around those, being trailer trash, they didn't work in France. And so when I finally learned to stop trying to fit in, stop trying to shine, it's when I finally started to shine. And so I had to learn to embrace humiliation and to just get over my ego. And that has been the biggest shift for me.
Deb, I want to ask you about mindset shift, and I wonder if yours is similar to mine. One of the really interesting things that I've found about living in Portugal is having to slow down. You have to actually ask someone how they're doing, how's their family, how was your weekend? Oh yes, and have you finished fixing my gutters yet? You can't just dive in. But the thing that's really been powerful for me about living in Dubai is, I'm a white lady. I'm one of the whitest white ladies who ever whited. I will speak to your manager, please. But here I get to use my white lady powers for good. So I don't know how a lot of the Arabic charities work, but I'm able to perform direct charity by tipping heavily to the people who are performing menial labor. I am able to interfere if somebody of my class or my race is picking on somebody else or speaking rudely to them. I can be the person who steps in and diffuses the situation and know that, number one, nobody's going to punch me, and number two, people are going to back off and accept that I am allowed to say break up the fight. When I was living in India, my taxi driver cut off a moped guy by accident. The moped guy fell off his moped. A giant crowd of people surrounded our taxi cab, broke the driver's side window, and began hauling the driver out to apparently beat him to death. I did discover later that, traffic mobs sometimes do that. And I shoved open my door, and I'm certain they were all really perplexed why a white lady in a sari was yelling at them. But they all went away, and they let our taxi driver take us back to the hotel. And it's really interesting to be able to consciously recognize my race and use it as a force for positivity when I can. And I hope that doesn't sound hideously arrogant, but it's been a really interesting thing. Deb, have you experienced that?
So I think one of the lessons for me was also about privilege as a fluid thing. I didn't understand even the idea that there were strong passports. And I used to get texts all the time because I have a UAE phone number, do you need a strong passport? Here's how you can buy a second passport. And so that idea, but also to see privilege as something that is fluid, right? So that as a white lady, I had this kind of privilege, but as a woman in the UAE, man, not so much. But then as a teacher, I had this, but then, so it's something that is multifaceted, I think, right? That if you speak American or if you speak British or if you speak, that's all a factor in it as well. So that to me was an ongoing lesson. And also the directness of being able to be involved in things. And the things that here seem really far away. It's like, oh, no, that hurricane in the Philippines, well, that impacted, 15 people I know. And so we're going to all work together to build, to put crates together to send directly to, Harshana's family and this and that and this and that. So the world became smaller in a lot of ways. And that was really useful. But I think if you're, and it is a slower place. And it used to be even slower because Friday, also living in
Our weekend used to be Friday, Saturday.
right. Oh, I was going
Yeah.
to say that. Our weekend used to be Friday because that was going to be the day that, you'd go to a mosque for prayers. And then the government was like, actually, no, we're now going to have a weekend that's Saturday and Sunday. And that is
Yeah.
unlike the US where it's like, we have to debate this and no. It's like, oh, actually, no, that's starting next week.
Sometimes it's a real pleasure to live in a place where the government has a ton of power.
Never mind.
Rent,
Make it so. Make it so.
Rent started to rise here a while ago, and then the government was like, hey, landowners, anybody who owns an unfinished building, finish it or we're taking it back. And they can do that here. So
But
we
I'm
are
gonna,
going
I'm gonna add one last thing, which is just one sentence, which is if you're going to move away, whether for 90 days or a year or forever, is that you have to sort of take with you the desire, you have to choose to be fascinated by where you are, because it's not going to be the same. And it will be frustrating, and it will be humiliating and humbling and beautiful and gorgeous. But you have to choose to say, this is really interesting. And if you don't do that, then you're just going to be really cranky and want to come home and look for the same brand of toothpaste, even though you're in Vietnam, because everything is so terrible. Sorry. Okay.
I love that. I choose to be fascinated. And I'm going to ask each of our other panelists to give us your top tip for what should we be thinking about? What should we be looking about as we want to head out into the world? And some of us are going to stick around for a few more minutes if you want to stick around and ask more questions. Otherwise, you can catch up with it on the YouTube. Joj, what is your number one top tip for somebody considering moving abroad?
I would say immerse yourself as much as possible in and really do a lot of research, but also be ready to maintain an online community back home so that you're not as isolated, because that transition can be a really rough one.
Love that. Alia, what's your number one top tip?
I'm going to speak from experience here. Paperwork. Do your paperwork. Do your paperwork early. Do your paperwork often. I think that people sometimes underestimate the amount and the precision of paperwork that is required to immigrate by choice. So get your criminal FBI report requested early. The government's falling apart. Might take extra time. Get your birth certificate. Get your passport up to date. Wherever you're thinking about going, make sure you look early, because it's not like you can just go, okay, now I'm ready, and then go. There might be another year of paperwork ahead of you. So if you're thinking about it, start gathering these essential documents, get your ducks in a row. It'll help ease your process. That's just a practicality.
Tara, what's your top tip?
Oh gosh. So it's funny because I just started this YouTube channel, which is kind of about this, but from a very sort of spiritual and emotional perspective. Like, what are the things? And so I would say be open to stepping into discomfort, because it's really uncomfortable all the time. Like, especially when you're having to speak another language. And there will be some who are kind and non-judgmental, and then there will be some who just are not. and that's uncomfortable. And I think, we're so used to being comfortable, particularly in the United States. And that's just not how it is when you're not in a sort of a dominant space, in terms of power, in terms of language, in terms of understanding everything that's going on. But it was in those moments where I'm just going to be uncomfortable, and that's okay, that I think I built like the resources internally to do it and to stick it out. And so and just set a really clear intention, like make sure you really want to do this. Yeah.
Absolutely love that. And I want to say too, if you can click through on that link, we'll send you the Expat 101 sheet, which is questions to ask yourself that Catherine McCullough has put together. More than anything, ask yourself, what do you value? And do your research into the countries you're interested in to see if they value those same things. My husband and I originally were going to move to Costa Rica. If anybody wants to buy some land, it's got 2 waterfalls and we're not moving there after all. And then I realized I want to be able to walk to the grocery store because I value keeping fit in my old age. And that means living in a place where I can walk a lot. And Costa Rica is not that place. I love Costa Rica. It's great. Their sidewalks are shitty and everything is really far away from everything else. Whereas in our little village in Portugal, I get to walk to the grocery store. I value having neighbors. Here in Dubai, it is hard to meet people outside of your own cultural or ethnicity group. And in Portugal, I already know all my neighbors. I know Joao the locksmith and Joao the architect and Joao who owns the guest house down the street. And now I know why last names were invented. And this ties back into that thing that Deb said that I think is so much what we need to think of is choose to be fascinated. How can we look outward into the world? How can that feed us in our hearts, in our minds, in our beautiful writing? We are going to stick around for just a little bit after this if people have more questions. Our next Writer's Bridge episode is on Tuesday. It's coming up real fast. It's our regular episode. We've got Darian Shu-Gi, who is coming on to talk about chapbooks, and it's called First Draft in 6 Weeks, the publishing power of chapbooks. So we encourage you to stick around for that as well. So we are going to hang out, but feel free to unmute yourselves and let us know if you've got a question. Use that hand raise button because we are so glad you're here. And if any of our panelists need to go, that's cool too. Thank you all so much for being here. Yay. And normally we also, feel free to unmute yourselves if you want to say goodbye too. We've got like a 30-second goodbye happening before we take more questions. So feel free to unmute yourselves for a joyful goodbye.
Bye. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Rebecca Morrison, what's your question?
Hi. That was really cool and really fun, and to hear all your stories. And interesting for me because of my experience is so different than most American people that haven't come from a country that they can't go back to or is dangerous or whatever. And I have lived in different countries before I came to America. But my question is, what about buying, did you buy a property? How difficult was that? Was it before your visa, after your visa? Have you had issues? I don't think we talked about tax that much, but I'm curious about that.
I can speak a little bit to buy. I didn't buy anything in Abu Dhabi, but I have friends who did. And I remember my friend Rachel saying, when she's British, and when she bought her house, people were like, "Oh my God, you're really putting down roots." And she said, "No, this way, when I'm ready to leave, I can just go without dealing with a landlord or a lease or anything. I can just get somebody to rent the apartment, the house, and then I can go." So she's also a lawyer. She made way more money than I did. But I know other people who have bought property as well. And I also know people who bought, like in Trump 1.0, some friends who bought an apartment in Athens because it came with the minimum spend, and it came with
Golden visa. Greek
with a
golden
golden
visa.
visa. They can now, and it now looks unbelievably brilliant, even more than it did in 2016.
Tara, did you buy or rent?
Rent. But when I first moved here, I wasn't exactly sure where I wanted to live. So I did the Airbnb thing around the different arrondissements because it's just hard. Every arrondissement here is so different.
Yeah.
And so despite the many visits I had made here, I did that first. And then I ended up going into contract with someone right before the pandemic happened. It was like, so thank God. But it is a nightmare looking for apartments here. I mean, I have a lot of friends who and know few people who have bought, but I don't know enough about that process to speak to it.
Alia, how about you? Did you buy or are you guys renting?
We're renting, and we've gone back and forth because there are a lot more places available to buy than to rent. And the housing market is getting a lot more expensive, but you can still get a pretty cool place for a fraction of what it would be in the US. But you know, it comes with a lot of tax responsibilities and complication. The biggest reason that we're glad that we didn't buy is that the first place that we moved here turned out that it was close to a factory that Portugal keeps a lot of its industry within the country, which is good for the economy in a lot of ways. However, there are some really stinky factories, and this is one of them. So it took us several months to realize, because it was only a certain time of the year, etc. You may find that the first place you land is not where you want to be. Now we're in this wonderful place where it might be the kind of place that we would like to buy, but this is 2 years after being here. So I would sort of, unless it is key to your visa plan, my general recommendation to people is to rent first, see if you like it, see where you want to be. You might be in the wrong part of the country for you.
Yeah.
It's so funny you
Yeah.
say that, because as I was researching before coming on kind of this topic, I saw this comment in one of these international chat groups that talk about moving abroad. This guy who said, you know, I knew this country, I loved it, but I wasn't sure where. And I was sure one city was the perfect place to buy, and then lived there for a while, it wasn't. And he tried different cities until he fell in love with the place. That's when he bought, which makes
Exactly.
My husband and I checked out Portugal. I went there kind of by accident. It's a long story, but I stayed in Porto for a week and I was like, I love this place. It's great. My husband and I went back and went to a number of locations in Portugal, checking out different places. I took a group of writers on a tour through Portugal, checking out more different places. And then we came over specifically on a house hunting trip. We looked for a lot of stuff online first to kind of get a sense of what was out there. Important to know, many foreign countries do not have an MLS system. In the United States, you can look and see what your neighbors paid for their house. In Portugal, in Costa Rica, in lots of Europe, you cannot. And countries that are high on the immigration target list right now often have houses priced at a price that I like to call, maybe some foreigner will pull up with a dump truck full of money. So, you know, and a lot of it really, I mean, just like anywhere, it boils down to location. My husband and I bought a 27-room house in a village because we're turning it into a writing retreat. It requires a lot of renovation. Nobody wanted grandma's house in the village that needed a new roof. And we have seen 2-bedroom apartments in Lisbon that cost the same as what we paid for our giant house in the village, because it is all location. Yeah. Sherry, what's your question?
It's not a question. I just would like to reiterate the idea that I was shocked when we announced we were moving. How many people thought we were going to sell our home in New Hampshire and buy something right away here? But I knew from living in New England that every town has a different personality. Doesn't really matter how nice your house is if you're in a town that doesn't suit you. So we waited 3.5 or 4 years. We rented the house in New Hampshire for a year. Although, to be honest, I knew I was never going back. I knew that. And we sold it and put the money in the bank, and we waited, and we finally found the right little house. Our GP pointed out that the Irish thing to do when you get old is you move into town. I had always lived in like 400 hectares of woods. So this
And now
was
you're
a big
closer.
deal,
Yeah.
but it was the right thing, really.
That's good.
We live
That's
right
really
across the
good.
street from a greengrocer who is wonderful and will never let us starve. Yeah. Great.
So, folks, we are going to wrap up so that we can let our people go. We're going to take London's question as our last question here. London, unmute yourself, ask your question. You are going to take us out into the world.
Okay. I am just wondering, I'm pretty sure I'm gonna go live with my brother in Australia for a year. And I started looking into how to get insurance coverage and all I found was like traveler's insurance that would cover emergencies, but I'm looking for insurance that's going to cover me so I can go see healthcare providers. Hopefully this is a quick and easy answer. Like, how do you do that?
Well, I know that am I muted? No. We used, when we were in Abu Dhabi, different insurance plans will have international coverage. And so it really is just a kind of a shopping around thing, I think. So when we were in Abu Dhabi, we had Aetna, which allowed us to do international stuff. And some people, a lot of Canadians had Daman, which allowed for some international, but not a lot. We now have American insurance, United Healthcare, which is like, what? You would go to another country? Fuck off and die. We don't care. So sorry about that. So you know, it's really just a question of looking around at different providers, and or
Tara
asking.
and George, did
Yeah.
you get onto the French national healthcare system, or are you on private insurance, or both?
Tara, go ahead and you answer first.
Not at first. At first I had expat insurance, and then I switched over once I got the residency sorted out. George, you have a...
Yeah, so I've done both, because when we first moved back to France as married people with kids, because we left married and went and got citizenship in the States, and then we went back to France with kids, we were actually working as American expats. My partner, though he is French, is considered an American expat. So we had an American through his work. But then when we went back to France the second time, it was on a local contract. And so then we were actually eligible for all the things, and not just eligible, but the required well visits, because your children are, especially if they are citizens, they are French citizens, and the government protects the citizens, even like between you and your child. The child belongs to France if they're a French citizen. And so yeah, so that was pretty amazing. Now our situation is different because we're back on sort of a diplomat thing. My partner is working in France as an American again, but on a global fusion experiment. Anyway, the one thing I want to say is that even if you come to France as a tourist, whatever you're going to pay in France is going to be peanuts compared to what you would pay, even copay wise, in the States. Going to the doctor, going to see just a generalist costs $25. $25. And if you have insurance, that's reimbursed. So you just pay $25 to go get seen. You can have all kinds of surgeries and etc.
And and
percentage.
it tends to be in Dubai, healthcare is a lot more accessible. I needed an appointment with the neurologist, so I picked the neurologist I wanted to see and made an appointment with him. And then he said, "Oh, I think you need an MRI. I'm just going to call downstairs," and down you go to get your MRI. I mean, it's much, much better than the US in pretty much every single way. Thank you all so much for being here. I want to close us out with the wonderful thing Deborah said earlier. Deb, will you tell us again what we need to do as we move forward?
We choose to be fascinated. And I suppose that's also pretty good advice as writers, right? It's what we do, is we
100%.
choose to
Thank
be
you all
fascinated.
for being here today. Happy writing, and thank you to our amazing guests.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.